I did not know his name when the galaxy first reacted to his arrival, only that the void itself seemed to hesitate, as though reality had briefly forgotten the rules by which it governed itself. And in those first long moments, those suffocating seconds, where every auger array across the Carthax fringe began screaming contradictory data, I remember thinking that this was not an invasion, not a warp incursion, not the clawed hand of chaos reaching out from the Imperium, but something far worse, an intrusion from outside all known categories, something that had not crawled into existence through ritual, faith, or evolution, but had stepped into it deliberately. I was stationed aboard the Mechanicus Archivum vessel Canticle of Ash, tasked with recording anomalous stellar phenomena near the Ghoul stars, a duty usually reserved for cataloging slow death-thread giants collapsing, dead worlds drifting. But when the first star dimmed without warning, without nova or gravitational collapse, simply fading as if its fusion heart had been turned down like a lumen dial, the Magi froze, their mechadendrites twitching in machine panic as their binhoric chants collapsed into static. Because stars are not meant to stop existing politely, and yet that was exactly what happened. One after another, their deaths spreading outward in a pattern that felt intentional, surgical, like the marks of a blade testing its edge. Astropaths across the sector fell screaming to their knees, blood pouring from eyes that could suddenly see too much and nothing at all, babbling about a pressure in the warp that was not turbulence but disapproval, as if the Imperium itself recoiled from an intruder it could neither tempt nor corrupt. And when Battlefleet Ultima translated into the system in a chorus of tearing warp scars, even the seasoned navigators were pale and shaking, whispering that the Astronomic and Holy Terror's undying beacon felt weaker here, not absent but diminished, as though its divine light was being weighed against something vast and found wanting. Then the picked feeds resolved him, floating alone at the dead center of the system, and every soul who saw him understood, without being told, that this was not a king arriving with heralds, nor a warlord accompanied by armies, but an executioner who required no witnesses, a towering figure clad in scarred gold and violet armor, his skin the color of bruised stone, his expression calm to the point of exhaustion, like a being burdened by inevitability rather than cruelty, and upon his left hand he wore a gauntlet that hurt to look at, not because it was ornate, but because it was wrong, set with 6 impossibilities that bent light, gravity, and causality around them, each one radiating a different fundamental violation of natural law. And I remember a senior Mogos whispering in horror that these energies were neither warp-based nor psychic, neither machine nor sorcery, but something older, deeper, as if the universe itself had been carved into fragments and worn like trophies. The first lance strike from the Imperial cruiser Unbroken Resolve never reached him, vanishing mid-void without explosion or distortion, leaving behind a perfect absence that made my stomach lurch. And when the fleet opened fire in disciplined fury macro cannons, torpedoes, plasma batteries, the figure finally moved, raising one massive hand with slow, weary certainty, and space itself seemed to fold inward. Entire salvos erased, not deflected, not absorbed, but unmade, as though they had never been conceived. And in that moment a terrible realization crept through me. This being was not testing Imperial defenses, he was observing, cataloging responses the way a scholar studies an insect before deciding whether it should continue to exist. Planets began to fail soon after, not burning, not exploding, but simply ceasing. Hive cities vanishing between heartbeats, oceans flattening into nothing, billions of souls erased without scream or echo in the warp. And that absence terrified the astropaths most of all, because death always leaves a psychic scar, a scream, a stain, but this left nothing, as if those lives had never been permitted the dignity of having existed. Vox traffic degenerated into prayer and hysteria, captains invoking the Emperor's name with the desperation of children calling for a parent who might not hear them, and I found myself thinking of the golden throne of the endless lie we tell ourselves that humanity's suffering has purpose, that survival itself is proof of righteousness. And as I stared at that lone figure adrift among extinguished suns, I felt a cold certainty settle into my bones. This being did not hate us, did not fear chaos, did not acknowledge the Emperor as a god or king, and that indifference was more horrifying than any demon's rage, because hatred implies passion, fear implies respect, but what stood before us felt only disappointment, as if the galaxy with all its wars, its empires, its gods and monsters had been examined carefully and found inefficient, bloated, unsustainable. And for the first time in my life I wondered whether the Imperium's greatest enemy was not chaos, not Xenos, not heresy, but the possibility that the universe itself had finally grown tired of us and sent someone to clean the slate. The Imperium did what it always does when faced with the incomprehensibly, tried to classify it, to force the unknown into neat columns of dogma and doctrine, yet nothing about the being adrift in the dead system fit any catechism the Adeptus Terra possessed, and so the response fractured into panic masquerading as protocol. High Command designated the entity Xenos Extremis, then reclassified it as anomalous god form, then quietly elevated the threat designation to something I had never seen recorded outside apocryphal vaults, a mark reserved for realities that should not exist at all, and still the fleet fired. Because to cease firing would be to admit doubt, and doubt is heresy, yet every barrage ended the same way, erased or folded into nothing, as though the laws of war themselves no longer applied, while astropathic choirs screamed themselves into silence, attempting to warn neighboring sectors, their messages unraveling mid-transmission, not jammed, not blocked, but edited, stripped of urgency and context, leaving behind only fragments of prayer and static. And when the first Astartes strike force was deployed, Ultramarines of the 4th Company, their gene-forged bodies and ceramite armor, the pinnacle of the Emperor's design, I felt a traitorous surge of hope, because Space Marines are the Imperium's proof that it can still shape destiny through will alone. They descended in Thunderhawk gunships, blue and gold against a void, Vox channels roaring with oaths of moment and litanies of hate, and for a brief, cruel instant, it looked like the galaxy remembered how war was meant to be fought. Until the figure turned toward them, and I swear by the throne that his expression was not anger but resignation, like a man forced to correct a child's mistake for the 1000th time. And with a single motion of that gauntleted hand, the Thunderhawk ceased to exist. Not wreckage, not debris, just absence, leaving the Marines themselves exposed to vacuum for a heartbeat before they too were gone, their gene-wrought souls snuffed without leaving a ripple in the warp. And something inside the fleet commanders broke then, because Astartes do not die like that. They fall screaming, burning, defiant. But this was erasure, and erasure has no place in Imperial myth. Reports flooded in from across the segmentum of identical phenomena: stars dimming, worlds vanishing, populations halved without war or plague, and a pattern emerged that chilled me more than any casualty report. The losses were not random, but balanced, surgical, entire systems reduced by precise margins, as though some cosmic ledger was being brought into alignment. And the Order Malleus argued in closed chambers that this was a chaos god unlike any before, while the Ordo Xenos insisted no demon could exist without feeding the warp, and the Ordo Hereticus, in its infinite paranoia, began arresting governors for crimes that had not yet been defined, because someone, somewhere, had to be blamed. Then came the moment that changed everything. The moment I still hear in my dreams. The being spoke, not through Vox, not through psychic scream, but directly into the minds of every sentient within the system. His voice deep, measured, impossibly calm, layered with a weariness that suggested he had delivered this judgment many times before. And he said, simply, that the universe was finite, that resources were finite, that life without restraint was a cruelty masquerading as hope, and that suffering multiplied endlessly when left unchecked. And I felt sick because his words did not sound like madness or malice, but like cold, merciless logic stripped of empathy, the kind the Imperium itself often used to justify exterminatus. And I realized with horror that we recognized ourselves in him. Priests screamed blasphemy, calling him a liar, a devil, a test of faith. Yet even they faltered when he spoke of the Emperor, not with reverence or defiance, but as one might speak of a failed experiment, a being who had sought to impose order through domination rather than balance, who had chained an empire to endless war and called it survival. And when a Cardinal Astra attempted to denounce him over open Vox, proclaiming humanity's divine right to rule the stars, the figure merely closed his hand, and the Cardinal's flagship folded into itself like paper crushed by a bored child. Panic spread faster than any warp storm, as word reached Terra that the Astronomican S-light was dimming, not because it was attacked, but because fewer souls remained to believe in it. Entire sectors silenced before their screams could reach the throne world. And I found myself asking a question I had never dared before. What if this was not an enemy to be defeated, but a mirror held up to the Imperium's own sins, a reflection of its philosophy taken to its logical extreme? And when the being finally turned his gaze toward the galactic core, toward Holy Terra itself, I felt a certainty colder than fear settle over me. This was not a war for survival, not a crusade or a last stand, but a trial, and humanity had already failed the opening arguments. The first sign that something had gone terribly, unprecedentedly wrong was not an Imperial loss, but a silence within the warp itself, a stillness so profound that veteran navigators described it as standing inside a cathedral after the gods had quietly left. through a side door, because the Imperium, for all its madness, is never quiet. It screams and writhes and whispers constantly. Yet now entire regions of it felt muted, flattened, as though some immense pressure were being applied from outside its reality. And when the first reports reached us that demonic manifestations were failing ritual circles, collapsing possession attempts, ending in nothing but dead cultists and empty shells, the Ordo Malleus dismissed it as statistical anomaly until the screams began, not from mortals but from the warp itself, echoing backward through astropathic relays like a psychic recoil. I was present in the sealed observation sanctum aboard the Lex Ultima when the Inquisitors finally understood that the being they had named Thanos, a name dredged from half-corrupted Xenos myth fragments, recovered from annihilated realities, had drawn the attention of the ruinous powers, and that for the first time since the birth of the Eye of Terror, Chaos was reacting not with hunger or delight, but with alarm. Khorne's realms fled first, great brass fortresses vomiting endless legions of bloodletters toward real space only for them to unravel upon manifestation, their rage finding no purchase against a force that did not acknowledge combat as a meaningful concept, while Tianchess labyrinthine plots collapsed in on themselves as futures once infinite narrowed into fewer and fewer viable strands, each terminating in the same cold conclusion, and the Lord of Change himself screamed across 1,000 timelines that causality was being pruned, that possibility itself was dying. Slanesh howled in a way that made hardened psychers retch, because desire means nothing when choice is removed, when excess is rendered irrelevant by enforced equilibrium, and even Nurgle's jovial decay faltered, his plagues failing to spread in systems already judged and reduced. Entropy denied its slow feast by an executioner who preferred efficiency over rot. The warp boiled as the Chaos Gods focused their will, hurling avatars, champions, entire wars of madness toward the intruder. And for a moment, just a heartbeat, it seemed as though the galaxy remembered its old terror, as reality tore and demonic storms swallowed fleets. But then the gauntlet fled each stone, answering a different blasphemy, and the warp recoiled as if struck. Entire demonic hosts erased not merely from real space but from memory, their names unspoken, their symbols fading from cult inscriptions as if they had never inspired worship at all. And that was when panic truly set in among the Inquisition, because chaos does not die, it reforms, it remembers. Yet this was something else, something closer to deletion. And I remember an Ordo Malleus lord whispering that the warp was not being conquered, but edited. Then came the impossible communication, not conquestors. Thanos turned his attention inward, toward the Imperium itself, his presence pressing into it like a finger against a wound. And in a moment that will never be recorded in any official chronicle, the Chaos Gods felt something they had not known since their gestation in the minds of mortals. Limitation, their domains shrinking not from starvation but from forced reduction, their infinite wars constrained by an external rule that did not bargain or tempt or corrupt. And I realized with mounting dread that Thanos did not see chaos as evil, but as inefficiency made manifest, a feedback loop of suffering that produced no final resolution. Cult uprisings across the Imperium collapsed overnight as their patrons fell silent, demons refusing summons not out of fear, but because the pathways no longer led anywhere. And in the Eye of Terror itself, ancient warp currents stilled, the storm's edges tightening as if reality were slowly stitching itself closed. Yet the most horrifying moment came not from chaos, but from Terror's own savant, when a forbidden conclave of psychos reported that the Emperor's presence in the warp faint fractured, but Eternal had been noticed, not challenged, not attacked, but acknowledged with a kind of grim respect, as though two distant titans had recognized one another across an abyss. And in that instant I understood the scale of what was unfolding. Thanos was not here to replace gods, nor to be worshipped, nor even to rule, but to impose a final accounting upon a universe that had allowed its horrors to spiral endlessly, and the Chaos Gods, embodiments of excess and emotion, could not defeat a philosophy that considered them symptoms rather than threats. As the warp continued to quiet, astropaths reported something unthinkable: souls passing into death without screaming, without feeding the Imperium, slipping into nothingness instead. And I felt a creeping terror that surpassed even demonic invasion, because for the first time, the galaxy's greatest horror was being solved, and in solving it, something essential, something human, was being erased alongside it. And as Thanos drifted closer to the galactic core, his path marked by balanced annihilation and dreadful calm, I wondered whether the Imperium's endless war had finally summoned not damnation, but correction, and whether survival itself was about to be judged an indulgence the universe could no longer afford. The moment Thanos turned fully toward, terror was not marked by alarms or warp storms, but by a sensation of collective pressure. as though every thinking being in the Imperium felt an invisible weight settle upon their thoughts. A gravity not of mass but of consequence, because Holy Terra is not merely a planet but a contradiction held together by belief, a world that should have collapsed under its own history long ago yet persists because trillions accept that it must. And when the gauntlet figure crossed the threshold where the Astronomican's light burns brightest, that light did not flare in defiance or dim in fear, but narrowed, focused, becoming something sharp and intent. And I was in the Hall of Leng when the High Lords fell silent amid their endless political warfare evaporating as every psyker in the chamber gasped at once, clutching their heads as the Emperor's presence vast, fragmented, eternal shifted, not awakening, not rising from the golden throne, but attending, like a mind turning its attention from distant echoes to a single, immediate sound. The Custodes felt it first, their Jinalock devotion flaring into something close to pain as they knelt instinctively, not in prayer but in recognition. And across Terra's endless catacombs, the Golden Throne's ancient mechanisms screamed as if protesting the strain of an encounter it had never been designed to mediate. Because what approached was not a challenger seeking the Emperor's crown, but a philosophy that questioned the throne's very necessity. There was no battlefield, no clash of armies, no grand exchange of blows to be mythologized later, only a convergence of wills across dimensions. As Thanos entered the psychic radius of the Emperor's soul and paused, floating above Terra's scarred atmosphere like a judge before the final hearing, and for a heartbeat that seemed to stretch into eternity, the galaxy held its breath, and then the contact occurred, not as speech or vision, but as mutual comprehension, a collision of intent so immense that lesser minds nearby burned out like insects near a star. And in that silent exchange I felt something terrifyingly intimate. The Emperor's vast, fractured consciousness stitched together by sacrifice, agony, and faith pressing against Thanos' calm, inexorable certainty, and neither recoiled. I do not know what was shown between them, only the effects that rippled outward. The Emperor's millennia of compromise laid bare, the endless wars justified as necessity, the lie that suffering could be redeemed by survival, while Thanos' own history bled through in cold, merciless logic, worlds saved by culling, civilizations stabilized by enforced balance, compassion redefined as prevention rather than cure, and I realized with a sickening clarity that neither was wholly wrong, nor wholly right, that both were tyrants shaped by a universe that punishes restraint as often as it punishes excess. Terra's skies darkened as psychic backlash manifested in reality. Clouds twisting into impossible geometries, oceans stilling as tides forgot their rhythm. And across the Imperium, astropaths screamed not in pain but in grief, because the Emperor's presence wavered, not weakening but questioning, and that hesitation was something the Imperium had never prepared for, never allowed itself to imagine. For faith demands certainty even when reality does not. Thanos did not strike the Golden Throne, did not attempt to unmake the Emperor, and that restraint was perhaps the cruelest act of all, because instead he showed him outcomes, futures where humanity continued as it was endless war, endless consumption, endless sacrifice, and futures where it was reduced, stabilized, forced into a smaller, colder existence. And I felt the Emperors will strain against those visions, clinging to the belief that potential justified suffering, that humanity's capacity for greatness outweighed its excesses. And for the first time in 10,000 years, that belief was challenged by something immune to hope. The Custodes wept openly then, though they would never admit it, as the Golden Throne's light flickered not like a dying flame but like one shielded from a sudden wind. And when the psychic storm subsided, Thanos withdrew a fraction, his judgment not yet rendered, his expression unchanged, yet something had shifted. Because the Emperor had not been erased, and Thanos had not been convinced. And in that unresolved tension lay the Imperium's greatest terror, uncertainty. The being turned away from terror slowly, deliberately, as if granting time rather than mercy, and as he departed the Astronomican's light steadied, though it felt thinner, as if belief alone could no longer sustain its former brilliance. And I understood then that this encounter was not the end, but a pause, a stay of execution while the universe awaited further evidence. In the aftermath, the High Lords issued proclamations of divine victory, of the Emperor's supremacy reaffirmed, yet behind closed doors, the truth gnawed at us all that the Master of Mankind had not triumphed, only endured, and that Thanos, arbiter of balance, had seen something worth postponing annihilation for, a hesitation that cut deeper than any blow, because it implied that humanity's fate was no longer solely its own. And as I looked upon Terra's battered skies, I wondered whether survival had become a provisional privilege, granted not by a god, but by an accountant of existence still weighing the cost of letting us continue. The Imperium's answer to uncertainty was not reflection, nor restraint, but escalation, because humanity has never survived by accepting judgment quietly. And in the weeks that followed Thanos' withdrawal from Terra, 1,000 desperate plans were set into motion, each one born of the same ancient fear that had driven the Great Crusade itself, the terror of being rendered irrelevant. The High Lords authorized projects that had been sealed since the Horus Heresy. Vaults beneath Mars and Luna opened to the air for the first time in millennia, their contents revealed not as relics of hope but of shame, weapons and theories deemed too dangerous even for extinction-level war. And I was seconded to the Adeptus Mechanicus expedition that unearthed the first of them, a pre-imperial reality anchor array designed not to destroy an enemy but to pin it, to force a being bound by no known physics into a localized frame of causality. And as the Magi reassembled its impossible geometry, chanting Binhoric prayers that shook with doubt, I saw in their augmetic eyes the same fear that haunted the priests of Terranot, fear of annihilation, but of being judged insufficient. Across the galaxy, Forge Worlds began screaming as they pushed their manufactoria beyond safe limits. Titans were awakened not to defend worlds but to act as sacrificial data points there. Princeps ordered to engage Thanos directly if he reappeared, not with any expectation of victory but to observe, to measure, to learn, because knowledge even bought with god machines in their crews was preferable to ignorance. Meanwhile, the Inquisition fractured into open ideological war, with some arguing that Thanos represented a necessary corrective, a force that might finally end the Imperium's spiral into endless atrocity, while others branded such thoughts as the ultimate heresy, a surrender of human sovereignty to an external arbiter. And entire conclaves vanished overnight, purged by assassins whose orders bore no sigil, only the unspoken understanding that dissent itself had become an existential threat. When Thanos returned to real space near the Halo stars, he did so not as an invader but as a constant, his presence now accompanied by a subtle restructuring of reality, warp routes narrowing, resource-rich systems vanishing in perfect proportion, and humanity struck back with everything it had left. Cyclonic torpedoes and forbidden gravitic weapons unleashed in volleys that would have cracked planets, yet each time the gauntlet flared and the attacks unraveled, leaving behind only data and despair. Until at last the Mechanicus deployed the reality anchor, a vast lattice of force projected from a ring of sacrificed worlds, and for the first time since his arrival, Thanos stopped his motion, arrested his outline sharpening as if forced into focus, and a cry went up across Imperial channels, not of triumph but disbelief, because for a brief, terrible instant it seemed as though the universe itself had agreed to humanity's terms. Titans fired, fleets burned, their reactors dry. Psychers screamed themselves into ash, trying to lay a warp pressure atop physical restraint, and in that moment I saw the Imperium at its most honest, not noble or righteous, but defiant, clawing at fate with bloody fingers, refusing to accept that its suffering might be meaningless. And then Thanos looked at the lattice around him, at the collapsing worlds fueling it, at the lives willingly spent to delay judgment, and something in his expression changed, not anger, not fear, but recognition. And when he closed his fist, the reality anchor shattered. Not explosively, but decisively, its principles unraveled, its designers erased from history as if their ideas had never been conceived, and the backlash tore through the Imperial forces like a final accounting. Fleets reduced, Titans stilled mid-stride, entire Forge worlds falling silent as their machine spirits died with them. Yet even in that devastation, something else occurred, something that no projection had accounted for, because humanity did not break, did not beg, did not kneel, but continued to fight in smaller, more desperate ways, refusing evacuation orders, launching pilgrim fleets at Thanos not to harm him but to witness him, to assert existence through defiance alone. And I felt a strange, painful pride then, because in that refusal to go quietly lay the Imperium's truest legacy. Not conquest or domination, but stubborn persistence in the face of a universe that offered no guarantees. Thanos watched it all, his path of balance continuing, yet subtly altered, his reductions no longer perfectly symmetrical, his pauses longer, as if the data humanity provided through its resistance complicated his calculations. And I wondered whether defiance itself had become a variable he had not fully accounted for, a cost that could not be neatly quantified. And as the galaxy burned and stabilized in equal measure, I realized that this was no longer a simple judgment or a doomed rebellion, but a dialogue written in extinction and survival, each side testing whether the other's philosophy could truly endure. And in that unresolved struggle lay the Imperium's last, Fragile hope that even if humanity could not defeat the arbiter of balance, it might yet prove itself too complex, too irrational, too stubbornly alive to be neatly erased. The end did not come with a snap nor a scream, nor the kind of apocalyptic punctuation the Imperium had always expected to mark its final hour, but with something far more unsettling. Choice, because after centuries of being ruled by gods, tyrants, and necessity, humanity was confronted not with annihilation, but with an ultimatum written into the quiet mathematics of survival. And I was still alive to record it, only because Thanos had allowed observers to remain, witnesses preserved, not out of mercy, but because evidence mattered to him. The galaxy by then was changed beyond recognition. Entire regions reduced to silence, while others stabilized into an uneasy equilibrium. Wars burning out not through victory, but through the absence of bodies to fuel them. And the warp, once a screaming ocean of madness, now flowed in constrained currents, demonic incursions, rare and fragile. Chaos diminished not by faith or force, but by starvation of excess. And the Imperium staggered through this new reality like a wounded beast, unsure whether it had been spared or merely delayed. Then the message came, not broadcast, not spoken, but impressed upon every mind capable of understanding Consequencenor's final accounting, delivered without malice or triumph, stating that the universe could continue in this reduced, regulated state, that humanity would survive, not as a sprawling empire of endless war, but as a contained civilization bound by enforced limits, its expansion curtailed, its population held in balance, its suffering reduced by the removal of scale itself. Or it could reject the verdict and face continued correction until balance was achieved by extinction. And I felt something fracture across the Imperium then, because for the first time there was no external enemy to rally against, no live inevitable victory to cling to, only a mirror held up to 10,000 years of choices. The High Lords argued, of course, some seeing in this offer a chance at salvation, others declaring it the ultimate heresy, a cosmic compliance that would render the Emperor's dream obsolete. And in the depths of the Golden Throne, the Emperor endured in silence, his will present, but no longer absolute, his light steady, yet constrained, as though even he understood that command without consent could not answer a judgment this fundamental. Rebellion flared in pockets, worlds choosing defiance over survival, their destruction swift and eerily gentle, while others complied, their skies quieting, their wars ending not with victory but with exhaustion. And through it all Thanos remained, not ruling, not governing, but observing, intervening only when balance tipped too far in either direction, a constant pressure reminding the galaxy that excess now carried an immediate cost. I found myself walking through a hive city that no longer grew, its population fixed, its manufactoria regulated, its skies still choked with pollution but no longer blackened by endless expansion. And I could not decide whether I was witnessing the Imperium's salvation or its final humiliation, because humanity endured, yes, but smaller, quieter, stripped of the terrible grandeur that had once defined it, and I wondered whether survival without ambition was still survival at all. Cultists faded into irrelevance, their gods distant and weakened, while faith in the Emperor transformed from militant certainty into something closer to remembrance, a reverence for what he had tried to achieve, rather than a belief in inevitable triumph. And in that shift lay the Imperium's strangest transformation, not peace, but stillness. In my final recorded encounter, I watched Thanos drift at the edge of a stabilized system, stars burning steadily, populations within calculated limits, and for the first time, I sensed not judgment but weariness, as though even he understood the cost of imposing order upon a universe that resisted it at every level. And I realized then that this was not a story of victory or defeat, but of compromise enforced by power so vast, it made resistance symbolic rather than practical. Humanity had not been wiped away, nor had it proven itself worthy in any triumphant sense. It had simply persisted under new rules, its fate no longer solely its own, and as I sealed this, chronicle aware that it might one day be erased like so many others, I was left with a single haunting question that no doctrine could answer: whether the Imperium's endless war had been a tragedy corrected too late, or whether something essential had been lost in the balancing, something fragile and irrational and uniquely human that no cosmic accountant, however well-intentioned, could ever truly measure.